Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our workshop this afternoon. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered and pay our respects to their elders, both past and present. This webinar is being recorded and will be distributed by email to all of those who have attended today. You can ask questions throughout the webinar. On the top right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a blue hand. Just enter your questions. A pop-up will be at the bottom of your screen. We are going to address all questions at the end of the webinar and after the two presentations. I would like to introduce our two authors who will be presenting this event. Firstly, we have Kendra Briseka, who is the Academic Head of Social Studies at Oak Hill College and has served on the committee for the Society and Culture Association since 2019. Kendra facilitates professional learning seminars for the Society and Culture Association and lectures for the Society and Culture Method course at Macquarie University. And thank you for presenting today, Kendra. Also, we have Elizabeth Howard, who has been teaching Society and Culture at Thomas Hassell Anglican College for over a decade. Elizabeth frequently presents professional development, generally with a focus on how to excel on the personal interest project. So I'd like to thank them both for being here today, and we'll go ahead with the presentations, and thanks everyone.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you to looking at the focus study of Rwanda as a new country study within the Cambridge Society and Culture textbook. So thinking about first why Rwanda, it moves us away from the traditional Asian-based country studies to a region that is continuing to develop its identity independent of its colonial past. And when examining the example of Rwanda, this change has been extreme and has moved quite quickly since the significant turning point in their history, which was the Rwandan genocide. The timeline and application of Rwanda as a country study to the course is very straightforward and is accessible to a range of learners. And also Rwanda is really an example of an African success story. As the nation continues to develop progressive gender policies aimed at reconstruction and ethnic reconciliation, it also has a very progressive economic policy and is looking to become a high-income country by 2050. So when you're thinking about Rwanda with your students, some key considerations are, like I said, understanding its colonial past. So the history of Rwanda is really important to understanding what is happening in contemporary society, and this is where students have to start. So Rwanda has a tradition as a monarchy under the traditional social system of the Mwami. During the scramble for Africa in the 1800s, it was then taken over as a German colony. And then with the loss of Germany in World War I, it was taken up by Belgium as a trusteeship under the mandate system under the League of Nations. Unlike Germany, Belgium really worked to flip traditional social structures, whereas the Germans really wanted to uphold traditional systems in order to legitimize their authority in the country. Because of this, the Belgians continually brought up one culture while pushing down another. And this cyclical cycle of change created a lot of cultural animosity that didn't exist before this colonial period. Additional to this, they brought in phrenology, which is a pseudoscience associated with eugenics. And they used it to justify their choice of leadership within the country. And phrenology focuses on looking at the circumference of the head, the width of the nose, and the shape of the lips, wherein they use this to then justify the Tutsis as more European with more finer facial features, and the Hutu as blacker with more traditional African facial features. So from this then, we understand that with World War II, the big change across societies was the return of traditional lands to their indigenous people, and a lot of colonial powers began to leave their colonies in the 1950s. After a very short revolution in Rwanda, Rwanda officially declared a republic in 1961. And the first Tutsis left for exile in Uganda right after this, as cultural violence began to flare up immediately following the changeover. With this change, the Hutus came to power, and in 1973, Juvenal Habyarimana took over in a military coup, and his leadership continued until 1994. During this time, there was many examples of institutionalized racism, and in 1990, a group of exiled Tutsis in Uganda created the Rwandan Patriotic Front under the leadership of Paul Kagame. In 1994, while carrying out peace talks with Juvenal Habyarimana himself and the Burundian president Cyprien Ntaryamira were shot down from the on the 6th of April, and this then started the Rwandan genocide, which is a period of about 100 days leading to the murder of roughly 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus. So this is really important to understand the traditional nature of society and culture in Rwanda, and then from this you can start to introduce the contemporary context. So it is important to understand what the country looked like immediately following the genocide. So after the genocide, 70% of the population of Rwanda was female. Therefore, in order to rebuild, they had to harness the population that was available at the time. Also, just understanding the political landscape. Prior to the genocide, there were 785 judges. 20 of these judges survived. There was 74 members of parliament. None of the parliament prior to 1994 survived. There was 5 staff survivors. Also significant in looking at the nature of society and culture was the fact that roughly 130,000 suspects who had an active part as perpetrators in the genocide were living side by side with those that they committed acts of violence against. And that Rwanda had a prison system built to hold 12,000 people. Also, 13% of all families had a child aged 13 to 20, and for the most part female, as the head of the family. So Rwanda from this point in time was really looking to restructure, rebuild, and reconcile. And they began a transitional period of government, which was instituting new ministries, obviously electing new members of parliament. And this lasted from 1994 until 2000. And then from 2000 to 2003, we see the transition to the new constitution. Today, Rwanda is a global leader for progressive gender policy. They have the highest number of female representation in a national parliament of anywhere in the world, second place being Sweden. Currently, they have 64% of their national parliament is women. Rwanda also aims to become the Silicon Valley of Africa, and this is outlined in Vision 2020, which is their broad strategic plan, which has been amended to Vision 2035. And this has really established Rwanda as a hospitable environment where any company can be set up in 24 hours. A really good example of a success story that also ties to the dot point referring to access to technologies and how has this impacted rate and direction of change is that Mara Phones is the first all African made smartphone with all pieces produced and assembled in Rwanda. And contemporary policies are aimed at reconstruction and ethnic reconciliation. So with the study of Rwanda, the focus in continuity and change is gender roles and the status of men and women. And so Paul Kagame is the president of Rwanda, and he's also a really controversial figure when studying Rwanda as a country study because he embodies both authority and power within the study of Rwanda. So Kagame has a history as the leader of the Rwandan Patriotic Front in exile. He was the leader who at the time of the beginning of the genocide was actively negotiating the peace treaty. He was the vice president of Rwanda in the transitional government up to the enactment of the new constitution in 2003 and has been president since the previous president was sent out in 2000 under suspicion of corruption. And it's estimated that he will be president until 2034, which is another very controversial point that you can examine with your students. Because when examining him from the West, we tend to look at him through the Western context, and we see him as an authoritarian, but Rwandans see Kagame as a legitimate leader. They see him as somebody who has reinstated a lot of their lost rights and privileges, and he's looked on very favorably within the country. And it's his vision that has really promoted these progressive gender policies. So in examining this, we're going to examine it briefly, looking at first macro level, then meso level, and then micro level. So Kagame and many other high-ranking members of the RPF were raised in exile by single mothers who had been expelled from their country of origin. And because of this, he keenly understands what it's like to not be valued as an active citizen within your country. And because of this, too, he understands that the strength of women is necessary to have in leadership, and that if you don't harness the potential of the entire country, you will never be successful in achieving your goals. Because of this disadvantage, and because he knows this experience of exile, it is his vision that has led to the promotion of these progressive policies, and has led to really quick macro level changes. So what I want to do really quickly, and more of these are outlined and detailed in the text, but as I wanted to speak to a few of these macro level changes that he's put in. So the first one is Rwanda was the first one under an international tribunal to recognize rape as an act of genocide. During the genocide, upwards of 500,000 women were kept as sex slaves, were raped, and were mutilated by the Hutu militants, with the intention that men who were HIV positive would rape these women, would infect them, and this would then lead to their death. Following the genocide, 66% of the women who experienced sexual violence during the genocide were and are HIV positive. With this in mind, Rwanda declared that this was an act of violence against women, and in a historic judgment, they were the first international tribunal to define rape as an act of genocide and find an individual guilty based on acts of rape and sexual violence. Another really important thing that came around from Kagame was the inheritance law. This was changed in 1999 and again in 2000. So Kagame, traditional nature of society in Rwanda is that women, while they are very important members of the family, are not autonomous agents. They can speak on behalf of their husband, but they don't have the power to enter into contracts. They can't get a phone plan. They couldn't open a bank account. They couldn't own a house. And after the genocide, this was very problematic because the majority of the men were displaced or they were dead. So it's impossible to harness a population that doesn't have access to some of the necessities that you need to rebuild, which include bank accounts and money. So the Inheritance Act overturned traditional laws and allowed women the right to inherit land in the absence of a will, to enter into contracts, to seek paid employment, and to own property in their own names separate from their husbands. Again, important that they inherited lands from family members that had been murdered, and they could also open a bank account without the authorization of their husband. Another really significant thing for Rwandan females at a macro level is the Rwandan Constitution in 2003 implemented a 30% gender quota for the representation of women in Parliament. And while this has given women a good basis for entry, following the first election period in 2010, the majority of women exited these quota seats and opened them up for new women to run in. Many of these women were successful in running in their own right, and in 2010, the representation of women in Parliament was about 45%, and as I said before, today it's 64%. However, understanding that continuity and change, not all things are positive, Traditional male mindsets, especially on a micro level in rural areas, which the majority of Rwanda is, have largely been forgotten. And in the text, there's an interview that I did with Louise Mushikiwabo. She is the former foreign minister of Rwanda, and she spoke about the fact that today it is very obvious that they have a lot of work to do. The first generation of men born after the genocide are now roughly 25 years old, and a lot of the survivors are still holding on to some of those traditional mindsets. And they recognize that these need to be challenged. Another thing that's actively being challenged is the tolerance and acceptance of domestic violence. And they do this through programs like Safe School for Girls. So this is a program that runs across Rwanda, and it's really working with men, both young and old, to challenge traditional ideas of domestic violence, and to also really challenge traditional gender roles. Things as simple as changing nappies, taking care of babies, not going to the pub at night. So now looking at the meso level, some continuities that we see in Rwanda with regards to gender are traditional forms of justice. And when I say traditional, I mean long time traditional. This was a form of justice that was used by the Mwami prior to colonization, and this is called the Gacaca courts. So this was reinstated in 2001 because of the very significant backlog of war crimes cases that needed to be addressed. If these cases had gone through the International Court at The Hague, they would still be trying them. It was estimated that it would have taken up to 100 years to try all of the war criminals. So this was a type of community-based restorative justice. And what these trials did is that they got the perpetrators to face their victims, and then justice was decided at a community level. Again, a little bit of controversy surrounding this, with many people calling this Kagame's Boys Club. The fact that if you were able to ally yourself with his party, you got off a little bit lighter. Also interesting to note, at a macro level in Rwanda now, there is only one party. It's part of the controversy that surrounds Kagame, but he notes the fact that inter-party politics was part of the reason that cultural issues were brought up, and it helped to facilitate violence in the country. So he has blended all of the parties into one. A big change at a meso level looking at gender is the development of the Ministry of Gender and Family Promotion. This was one of the very first things created during the transition period, and it was headed at that time by Alosia Inyamba, who unfortunately passed away from cancer a few years ago, but up until the point that she got sick, was tipped to be Kagame's successor. And she developed a national program, which I do understand is a macro level program, but we really see the change on a meso level. And so what this program aimed to do was to place the hundreds of thousands of orphans that came about because of the genocide into homes. However, families who agreed to take the orphans could not question the cultural background of the child that they were taking in. And so this program really facilitates and supports reconciliation, that they're looking to reconcile the ethnic divide, and that the children have to be accepted and loved regardless of whether they are Hutu or Tutsi. So now moving on to micro level changes. So as I said before, some continuities in Rwanda are that traditional gender roles do consider. The main city in Rwanda is Kigali, and there definitely is, those in the city benefit more from change than those people in rural areas. So for people who live in the city, they have better access to technologies, they have consistent access to electricity, they are more often able to speak English. Rwanda is only one of 2 countries that has ever joined the Commonwealth without a British colonial past. They did this for security following the genocide, but because of that, their second language is English. And so in the rural areas where the majority of people live in Rwanda, it is an agrarian society, traditional gender roles continue. as I said before, women do have a very, very important role in the family. However, they are not seen as autonomous and are still considered a stand-in. And this is something that they are actively working to change. But again, it's been trickled down from the top, and this change is slow coming. So on a micro level, some changes that we see is that previously women have only held limited representation in local councils. Following the creation of the new constitution in 2003, the local government was restructured, and the new 5-tier system meant that there are more positions open for the representation of women at a micro level. Their representation is always also very visible. In these local councils, people are elected where if they want to run, they stand up, and then the people who want to vote for them stand behind them. So this is creating very visible change as these traditional gender norms are challenged, and men, old and young, are supporting these women. Also, what we see on a micro level is that for the first time, women are really able to apply their existing proficiencies in the private sphere to community programs. So, for example, their role as a nurturer in the household has been used, as many women in rural communities are the head of a blended family, with orphans being adopted after the genocide. Also, their work around the house, many women then became the head of social programs that helped to rebuild Rwanda after the genocide. So now thinking about social theory and its application to Rwanda. In the text, I outline both interactionism and functionalism. However, I have taught this unit with my class this year, and we taught it through the lens of social interactionism. So interactionism is our only micro-level theory. However, in this instance, I think it's really effective for understanding macro-level change. So part of the thing that I've discussed is that at a micro level, they've had very firmly entrenched gender norms, with women being very central to the family and very much appreciated and loved, but having a very limited role in society. When Kagame was rebuilding and restructuring the government, when he put in this 30% quota, when he was reinstituting women as judges, so 4 out of 7 Supreme Court judges in Rwanda are women, if there was not support at a micro level, these quota seats would have stayed empty. And so with my class, I've approached this through the perspective of communication at a micro level has been the vehicle for change. That if men weren't willing to support their wives in stepping into these new positions, despite progressive policies, women wouldn't have been allowed from the domestic into the public sphere. And so the language that I use around this is understanding this as an example of positive discrimination or affirmative action as government policy. So the practice of favoring individuals belonging to groups known to have been discriminated against previously. Thinking about this too, reconstruction, reconciliation, and development has been led by women, and this has been fiercely supported by macro-level policies. And some of the ways that we can support our students in understanding how these macro-level policies have been supported on a micro level is first through the example of the gender quota. Also recognizing the Ministry of Gender and Family Promotion as one of the first ministries that was created following the genocide. Rwanda also has gender budgeting, which is that 50% of all macro level funding must go to the benefit of women. And they also have one-to-one employment. So at a macro level, in any level of the government, for every male that is hired, there will be a female hired next. Also interestingly, in speaking with Louise Mishikawabo, she spoke about the fact that for any foreign delegations that come to Rwanda, it is understood and made very clear to these groups that their acceptance will be limited if their delegation is not made up of a significant portion of women. So with this, teaching Rwanda this year for the first time to my class, one of the really difficult things, I think, in getting a new textbook is understanding first that you have to change your topic. This requires resourcing, building new PowerPoints, finding different links and things that you can show to your students. And so what I wanted to do is just take a few minutes right now and show you some of the resources that are available to you through the teacher's pack for the Cambridge textbook. So, like I said, I have tested this topic on my class this year. It is really, really successful, very straightforward. Rwanda too, because of Vision 2020 and their goals with regards to technology, becoming the Silicon Valley of Africa, there's really interesting information that you can speak to your class about with some of their policies. For example, they want to have a computer room in every school, but rural areas have really limited access to electricity, so they literally have computer rooms with no plugins. Rwanda meets a lot of the dot points very easily, and thus is a topic that can be used for a range of learners. Your top learners, you can really push to get them to explore and better understand some of these contemporary gender policies. And your bottom learners, there are very clear examples that you can align to all of the dot points. But what's on the screen now is one of the PowerPoints that comes in the teacher's pack. So this is Rwanda and the core concepts. As I said before, this is something that I built, I've used with my class. It talks about some of the background with regards to continuity and change in Rwanda. And then it goes through some examples of continuity and change, and specifically that application to society, persons, environment, time. So it speaks about Rwanda and the society of it, close-knit family groups. An example of culture. Culture is really significant in Rwanda because a lot of traditional practices that fell out of favor just as the country modernized and due to colonial influences over time have really been the backbone of reconciliation in rural areas. So for example, practices like Imigongo painting, which is painting with cow dung, have become really popular again. They're sold on a global market. In Tori dancing and basket weaving for women has been really important because literally these women will sit in groups all day and weave baskets, and whether they're Hutu or Tutsi, that facilitates conversation and reconciliation. So this is one of the PowerPoints that you can go through with your students. Another one that is there is looking at gender roles and the status of men and women. Again, these come to you as PowerPoints, and so if what works in my brain doesn't work in yours, you have the ability to change these. And this one goes through quite a lot of the information that I've just gone through with you, but gives you, again, the breakdown of changes, continuity and change on the macro, meso, and micro levels of society. There is also a third one that I didn't include to show samples of in the presentation today. And then finally, one of the things that I think is the bane of all of our existence is programming. And for the teacher's pack for the textbook, you're also provided with a program that goes through each section of Rwanda and its application to the syllabus. So again, this is built off of my own syllabus and what worked for me this year, but again, is in a format coming to you that you're able to manipulate. So you're not necessarily starting from scratch if you're interested in looking at Rwanda as a focus study. And that is all for me. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it over to Christine.
I think we'll pass over to Elizabeth now.
Hi everyone, my name is Elizabeth Howard. It's my pleasure to be talking to you about Chapter 4 of the Cambridge Society and Culture textbook, which is looking at the personal project. If you are new to the course, or if you're not really sure what the personal interest project is, I just want to outline two things I'm going to go through in the presentation today, which is a clarification of the requirements of the key aspects of the project, and I want to provide you with a discussion around a timeline for progressive instruction when looking at the project. So first off, if you're a new teacher to society and culture, you might be thinking to yourself, what is the personal interest project and how do I tackle this project? Well, this is something that requires students to select a topic which is directly related to the society and culture course. So it can be it can be derived from any of the HSC studies, belief systems and ideologies, social conformity and non-conformity, popular culture, social inclusion and exclusion. So this is something that requires students to utilise both quantitative and qualitative primary and secondary research methods, and they do this to support their research findings. So really important to note from the outset of this project is that the PIP is marked on what is presented and it's marked against publicly accessible criteria. So as teachers of society and culture, we're able to actually access the NESA website and have a look at that marking criteria. And it's not really a secret or a surprise what kids are supposed to be doing. And that's where 40% of their external HSC mark. So it's quite a big project. And if you are like me and your students handed theirs in this week or whatever they did with the NESA time frame, you'll either be loving this presentation or you'll just be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm so glad it's done. But it's something that they do across the entirety of the course. And I want to talk a little bit about how the book will support you to clarify the requirements of each aspect of the project. And there are so many things that go into the PIP. There's so many facets. So if you're an experienced teacher, I think that the book will really help you to push students into the next marking band. But if you're new to the course, it's going to help you professionally to guide students on their writing. And I guess the main aim is to just debunk any myths, any confusion, any uncertainty that surrounds this project. So what we have done in including here is we've included Band 6 exemplars on each aspect of the project, as well as different scaffolds to help both students and teachers to access all parts of the project in a sophisticated manner. So these scaffolds are good for students who are low ability, but also for students who are higher ability students. So I want to just go through a few things that the PIP requires and how we've sort of addressed this in the textbook. The first thing that there seems to be a little bit of confusion on, or sometimes is not clear for teachers, is what is the cross-cultural component of the project. And the cross-cultural component of the project needs to include a view that is different from that of the writer. So that might include something in terms of a different generation, it could be a different gender, location, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, or cultural group. So the cross-cultural perspective is not something that just should be mentioned, but it actually needs to be explicitly justified and made reference to throughout the entirety of the work. PIPs that effectively fulfill this criteria, they clearly identify their cross-cultural perspective and ensure that it is integrated throughout each of the chapters. So sometimes my recommendation is that students would include their cross-cultural component in their title. And as demonstrated in the book, there's an excerpt of a student reference. So this comes from page 190. And if you have a look at the bottom, this student exemplar talks about how her cross-cultural perspective was Serbian Australian refugees, as she identifies with Serbian Australian. So different generations, but also to some extent, she's addressing the cross-cultural of location, someone coming from another place. The second part I want to talk to you about is continuity and change. So continuity and change is a mandatory component of the PIP, as outlined again by NESA, and therefore it means that every personal interest project needs to have some element of continuity, so things in their projects that have stayed the same, and change. What's evolved? What is different in regard to this topic? Continuity and change links to what we talk about as the time component. So when they're going through this, it's going to allow them to have greater insight into past, current trends, and maybe to some extent even what will happen in the future future? What are the probable directions of this research area that they're looking at? Linking it to time will also help students to consider differences or similarities. So the chosen time component for the project will allow students to consider and reflect upon broader differences in generational experiences and perspectives. So obviously we know that kids need to include continuity and change and a time component, and something that the book does will help you to understand choosing the correct time component will give students a starting point to measure continuity and change. So for example, I had a student last year who wanted to have a look at why there are not so many ministers that are women in Anglican churches. And we can't measure the whole history of the church in Australia. And so she chose 1970, which was the time that the first Anglican women or female minister was ordained. And so from that point, what stayed the same, but what's changed? So it gives students a parameter to effectively do their research when they have a defined time component. So again, we have an excerpt here from a student. This was an Assyrian student who looked at the impact of land ownership on cultural continuity, and so her cross-cultural was First Nation Australians, and she was able to tie that back to the removal of their land and so on and so forth. So specific time components will link to continuity and change and allow students to make sound and judgments there. I'm going to go through now a breakdown of the project in chronological order. So when a student submits their project in its entirety, this is what it needs to include from beginning to the end. So the first thing that they need to have is an introduction, which is 500 words, and it needs to pretty much revolve around these 5 aspects: what the topic is about and why it was chosen, the ways it contributes to a better understanding of society and culture, so what's their link to the syllabus, their cross-cultural component needs to be explained and justified. They need to talk about their ethical considerations. I know we talk about social cultural literacy and ethical considerations all the time, and what they did in this needs to be evidenced in their introduction. And it needs to link the research to how continuity and change or the time component is addressed. Now, something just as a thing that comes up in the introduction is sometimes people write the introduction in past tense. I will be researching, I will do this. Not actually the right tense to write the introduction in, because it's an introduction into their work. So it's what they have done, not what they plan to do. The next part is the log, which is 500 words as well. And the log needs to include a description of all of the elements of the PIT, the essential things that have occurred for students. In this, they need to explain the most useful research methods, those that were not helpful, evidence of their personal learning journey, as well as any decisions that were made throughout the PIT process. So in the textbook for all 4 of these points of the log and the 5 of the introduction, there are student excerpts of Band 6 examples of how they've actually addressed this in their introduction and in their log. Something that will probably take up about 6 months of our lives as society and culture teachers is the central material. Now, 2,500 to 4,000 words doesn't seem much, but is a huge feat for some of our students to really get over the line. The central material is obviously the section where the students are demonstrating the findings of their primary and secondary research. And as I mentioned before, it needs to include quantitative and qualitative data. It is here that they tell us, or whoever's reading it, the audience, what they have learned. And a key part of this is ensuring that students are consistently addressing and answering their question, their overall idea. Important to mention that Nesta says nothing about the requirements actually of having 3 chapters, but it's sort of been a generally advised structure in terms of the word limit. And just another comment on the word limit, a question I think that often comes up, or people are often wondering, is how strictly is the word limit supposed to be adhered to? Sometimes there's talk about, I think plus minus 10% is okay. Well, it actually needs to be followed clearly, because plus minus 10% is a university recommendation. It's not a NESA. And so when they're going over or under that word count, they're not actually making sure that it's concise and addressing the criteria. So what's been included in the textbook is for the central material is a chapter structure. And so what this does is it breaks down, I guess specifically for students who need a little bit more help with their literacy and are therefore a little bit lower ability, or even students who just write way too much. I'm not sure if you have any of those students and you're like, oh my gosh, wrap it up. Like we get the point. But this is a helpful scaffold of what a chapter structure could look like. So if we're starting at the central material, chapter 1, and the book breaks down what each chapter needs order by order. So the first part of the chapter material is they need to have an introduction. My suggestion for this part of the PIP is that students would introduce here their main idea or a key definition that their project has. So for this student here, Sophia, she was awarded a high distinction personal interest project, and her main theme was looking at feminism. And feminism can land differently to lots of different people. And so she clearly outlined straight away what feminism is. So defined as the political, social, economic equality of the sexes. So that's the introduction for the first chapter of the central material. So it's really helpful if you wanted to use this scaffold and allow students to slot in where different parts of their research can go. Then we have the body paragraph. That's really where students are answering their sub-questions. So they have their overall PIP question, 3 chapters of sub-questions. And it's here that we're asking students to analyse, synthesize and integrate their primary and secondary research together and display their results. Now they can use graphs, they can use charts, they can use quotes, as long as they are labelled and referenced correctly in the body of work. So this obviously can be in-text referencing or footnoting, either one is fine. And things that the students need to include in these body paragraphs are a topic sentence outlining the key ideas explored in the paragraph. So if you just don't know where to start when you are tackling this PIP, this is a great place. This is a great resource to use. Then including relevant secondary research, including conclusions and judgments. They need to integrate throughout the way in which primary research assists in answering the sub-question. They need to compare and contrast primary and secondary research findings. Sometimes we use the word triangulate. If that's too confusing for your students, we can just say compare and contrast. They're comparing, they're putting it together. What is key and then what is not. And then they're providing a judgment or perspective of what this means. And then to put it all together, they have in their chapters a concluding paragraph, which should generally revolve around summarising the main points of this chapter and then linking it back to the overall research idea. In this section, it's really important that students are showing the reader how the sub-research question and its results assist in answering the section of their main research question and relating this to the next chapter. Sometimes students might put in a rhetorical question which links to the next chapter, but as you can see here, and this is included in the textbook again, is the summary of these key ideas from a student. So really just taking away the mystery of what is supposed to happen in this central material, what are students supposed to be doing, how do we format it properly. And here she writes that thus fat activism has greatly evolved from 1966, that was her time component, to 2016 through the increasing influence of globalization, shifting emphasis from political issues to social desires and medical myths. So that's pretty much a summary or a scaffold there of the central material. The last thing that students need to have in their submission is a conclusion, which is also 500 words. The conclusion needs to include evidence of what they learnt throughout the project. They need to relate this back to the introduction and concepts that have been integrated throughout. And they want to logically follow ideas, arguments, and statements from the central material. So the conclusion is not the time where we want students to say, And hey, by the way, I figured this out, but this is another key part of my research. They're really just tying it all together. And in this, we want to see evidence of personal growth and cross-cultural insight. So they might say, thus this enhanced my social and cultural literacy because of this, this, and this. The last thing that they need to have is, and I write here a profound statement regarding the research undertaken, because the students had 9 months. I guess this year they had 10 months to do their PIP. And for them to say that they would have really benefited from more time, it's not really profound. We want to hear a profound statement. So in the future, I would have included a focus group, or I would have interviewed both males and females, or something that actually would have contributed to a better research project. So that's kind of the key aspects of the requirements of the personal interest project. And again, to reiterate, in the textbook, you'll see it when it comes out this week, but for the conclusion, for all 5 of those points, there's student excerpts, which actually show what this could look like for a variety of research. The second thing I want to talk about is an outline of how we can fit the PIP through the student's HSC experience. How can we actually do that? So at the end of the day, it's not the weekend before the PIPs are due and you're stressed, or we don't have a student whose work we've seen. Now, I know that there are many teachers here from many different contexts, and you all have your own challenges when submitting work, but something that really works for me when having a PIP calendar is I either give it to the parents at parent-teacher interview and I ask them to sign it, or I email it to them and I ask that they've received it. So for us at our school, parental involvement is quite important. They want to be on board. But I guess at the end of the day, what staff members really want to do is avoid a non-certification, or the point where we don't know if it's the student's own work. So the key, I believe, for the PIP is actually chunking it and giving it to students in small, manageable sections. So here, what we've included is a bit of a key, a bit of a guideline for how the students can approach the PIP, starting with week 4 of term 4. We want students really, ideally, to have finalized their research area. Now, I'm not sure if it just happens to me or if we get to February and March and kids are like, I don't like my research topic anymore. Well, hopefully they've done a lot of work to get to this point, so they don't want to flip and change. Okay, that's the key part of the PIP journey, I guess, is helping them to find a suitable research topic. And the textbook goes into lots of different ways to stimulate curiosity and interest for students in order to maintain their engagement across the entirety of the course. The last part that it goes through is, on the next slide, some more breakdown. I wanted to just draw your attention to one thing that I think could be helpful should you choose to follow this PIP calendar, is that all PIP aspects are due to the teacher for editing or for review before the term 3 school holidays. We did this year, and I was very thankful that I had seen all of my students' PIPs, pretty much all of my students' PIPs, in their entirety before the school holidays. And so when we went into lockdown, it wasn't a huge problem because we had sort of taken steps. So this obviously is dependent, and this can be adapted depending on your trial schedule. But according to our trial schedule, this works because I don't want students submitting their PIPs on the first day of their trial exam. It's just too stressful for them. I've done it before, never again. Early term 3, they then certify that with the teacher. We kind of go through it again, and then they get to celebrate because they have achieved something remarkable. So that's just a little bit of an overview of how Cambridge and myself, how we approach Chapter 4 of the Personal Interest Project, but really aiming to break down the myths and the mystery around how to do really well in the PIP. So that's all from me. We're going to flick now to the questions. So if you have a question for Kendra or myself regarding what we talked about, or something about the chapter, you can ask that. Or if you have a question for Christine in terms of what does it look like, when is it coming out, the teacher resource pack, so on and so forth. You can feel free to ask that now. Okay, Christine, a question has come through. Can you explain what the teacher resource pack involves?
Okay, thank you very much. The teacher resource pack is it's actually the online teacher suite. It supports the textbook. It has a task manager. We'll start off with the student textbook. The student textbook, it has an interactive textbook included plus a PDF. Now, this includes 3 activations for the textbook, so Year 11 students can take it on to Year 12, and then new Year 11 come the next year will have be able to activate it again. There's videos, auto-mark quizzes at the end of every chapter. There's workspaces in the interactive textbook for review questions to allow students to enter their answers and self-assess. There's a timed online competition at the end of every chapter, rollover key terms, word versions of all activities, media studies and review questions. So to support that interactive textbook, we have the online teacher suite. And with that, you can set tasks for your students, can be used to direct students on custom activity sequence based on their ability. And it reports on individual and class progress. So there's reporting functionality throughout. You can see how they go in their quick drill and practice in the Scorcher, and their questions they've answered in their workspaces. You have suggested responses to all activities in the textbook, so that's really great. There's a practice exam also. We've had these authors working hard. All the teaching programs, and there's PowerPoint presentations for every chapter. So and the teacher online suite is included with every class set purchase. If you purchase a class set, it's free, or you book list the title.
Okay. Thanks, Christine. There's one more question for you. When is the textbook available for order?
Okay, well, you can order it with your booksellers straight away. Just ask them for a quote, or we can organise a quote for you through your bookseller, but it's available next week, so that's pretty exciting. Yep, so it's the 17th, that's next week. At the end of next week, it will be available.
All right, Elizabeth, one for you. Regarding PIPs, is there a difference between addressing continuity and change and using generations as a cross-cultural component?
It's a good question, and I think that sometimes that can be a blurry line. When addressing continuity and change, the key part of that is having a time component. So when we're looking at continuity and change, there needs to be a time component. So from there, we can measure what has stayed the same and what has changed. So if a student is looking at a cross-cultural component, looking at family structures of baby boomer generation, and they're looking at the 1950s, 1950s is a good time component, and therefore they can use generations as a cross-cultural component. But I think it does need to be explicitly stated that the reason why they're choosing 1950 is because, not just because of their cross-cultural component, but from there, they're linking it to their research question. So I would say that there is a difference, but it's sometimes really nice when they can be used interchangeably, and they link so well together.
And Christine, there's another question for you here. We use Box of Books. Can we access the teacher pack through them?
Yes, we work very closely with Box of Books, and we will set up the teacher resource for you, for yourself and your staff, when the book has been adopted.
Great. There was also a question regarding the calendar. So for the chapters 1 and 2, due in term 1, how do I find the students go with completing the primary research? Look, it's a constant battle, I'm not going to lie, but I think having that time frame, it helps them to know that after the Christmas holidays, or during the Christmas holidays and the term 1 school holidays, they can get majority of their research done. In a perfect world, that always happens. If it doesn't, I just ask students to highlight where they want to put their primary research. But generally speaking, the chunking of the PIP from the calendar excerpt, it really helps them to know that that's coming up. So, I mean, it depends how you go with your approach to students getting work done. Usually for me, a conversation around an email home sort of helps me to fix that one, and they generally get that done. But again, the context is, it depends very much on that. But yeah, if they're following the calendar up until that point, I have found that generally speaking, that is a helpful guideline. Obviously, if they need to go back and edit or take some work from this chapter here and here, that's fine. But my recommendation to students is always over the Christmas holidays and the end of term 4, trying to get as much of the main primary research done really helps them to have success later on during the writing process.
One person has asked, can you tell us the case studies chosen for the depth studies? So for the chapters that I've done, continuity and change is Rwanda, popular culture is social media, and conformity and nonconformity is survivalists.
And belief systems and ideologies is multiculture. And for social inclusion and exclusion, it is asylum seekers and refugees in Australia. For the social and cultural world, the focus study is the Gypsy Roma. For chapter 2, it is Indigenous cultures in South America. And for intercultural communication, it is, Kendra, what's intercultural communication? We didn't write that one.
Is that one the Tuareg people?
That's right, yeah. It's been a little while since I've had a look at intercultural communication, but you're correct in saying that one.
Christine, another question. Is there an online feature like Jacaranda's Learn On? I mostly use Jacaranda books in case we go into lockdown.
Yes, as I said, there's an interactive textbook, and the online teacher suite attaches to the students' accounts, and you can send them tasks and that sort. You can set tasks and homework facilities there.
And Christine, another question from you. When will the people who are attending the webinar receive their textbook?
Okay, well, tomorrow we will send you you'll receive an email. It's a feedback form via email, and then if you could enter all your school address or home address, what may be, probably that's where you'll be receiving it. So next week the book will be published, so I would say later the following week would be the earliest you'd receive it. We've still got our warehouse open in Melbourne, so there's quite a few people attending today, but we'll make sure you get the books as soon as possible.
And the question here on Rwanda, in examining Rwanda, does the text examine economic issues as well? Do you look at Central Africa's part in global supply chains, artisanal mining, and coltan? So no, we focus really just on the experience of Rwanda. Predominantly, this is through Vision 2020, which is amended to 2035 and some points to 2050. And this is really their economic vision for Rwanda, which is really focusing on Rwanda as a manufacturing hub. It looks into the fact that you can establish a business there in 24 hours, that they have really progressive policies and really close alliances now with the UK, but Rwanda does not have a big mining industry, if any, and they are focusing more on tertiary industries. Another really big thing in Rwanda is they're looking at the expansion of education. So they've created, for example, a medical university in the north of Rwanda that gives free education to women and some of the other people who apply for it. And in exchange, you have to do basically a 5-year placement in a rural community. And then once you've given back to the community for 5 years, then you can focus on charging fees for yourself. And is there a matrix available that could be applied to revise for the country focus study? No, not included with the teacher resources. And then in regards to Rwanda as a case study, is there a complementary depth study? So I actually pair Rwanda, we do work cross-curricularly with history. In history, we do the Holocaust in year 10. And then part of what we do for intercultural communication, what I did last year and what we were going to do this year, is I bring in a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. And he speaks to the year 11 students with regards to intercultural communication. And then he also speaks to the year 10 history students who are doing the Holocaust. And that's an example, obviously, of a more contemporary genocide. So at my school, we focused more on pairing it with the year 11 course and other courses across the curriculums.
Hey, Christine, I think that's all of the questions. Oh, one more has come through for you, Christine. Does the online feature come with a physical textbook, or does it have to be purchased?
No, the online feature is included with the print book. So you can purchase the Society and Culture resource as a digital-only product, or you can purchase the print book, which includes the interactive textbook. And as I mentioned, it has 3 activations with the book. So that's great. So you know that you've got 3 years worth of interactivity for your students.
Great. Well, that is all of the questions, Christine.
Okay, well, thank you. I'd like to thank Kendra and Elizabeth for presenting today. Both of the presentations were fantastic. I'm sure you will all agree. If you have any other questions, as I said, tomorrow you'll be receiving an email. Feel free to email me at cdivine@cambridge.org and I'll endeavour to contact the authors if you have any questions you think of or any questions for me. And I want to thank you all for attending, and we're all looking forward to seeing the book being published. So thanks everyone.